Welcome to you all. What a fine looking class. It's great to have you here. I think that you've made a great choice, as I feel like I made a great choice a year ago. This is a school that's on an unbelievably upward trajectory, so it's really fun to be along for the ride. It moves at an incredibly quick pace. It provides opportunities that I think are unparalleled in terms of what you're going to be exposed to as MBA students, the kinds of courses you're going to see, the kinds of guest speakers that you're going to be exposed to. Hold on to your seats because it's going to be a phenomenal year. So congratulations on making a great choice. It's not only, of course, we have to think about it in terms of ROI and return on investment, and I do think it's a great investment in terms of your money. I'd like to also talk today a little bit about the investment in terms of what you're doing as a human being, how this fits on your life journey. And I think that's the more important investment in terms of the skill sets you gain, the insights that you deliver, the maturity with which you go back out into industry, the different ways that you see problems. I think that that's the investment that's a lot harder to calculate in terms of dollars and cents, but I think that it's a huge one, and I congratulate you on making it, because it isn't always easy to do. So what I'd like to talk to you a little bit about today, and so we're still on agenda here. So
yeah, so we got to mix up here.
What I'm going to talk to you today, I'll just talk as we get the slides ready, is I'm going to talk to you a little bit about soft skills training. And the reason for that is because, as you heard, I'm a passionate educator and I love the field of organizational behavior. So I have an inclination around soft skills training and leadership training anyway. But coming into this position and talking to industry more than ever, especially about graduates instead of my research or my consulting, talking about our graduates, and hearing from them that they're looking for soft skills in their employers. Thank you, Bill. And so I often drill down to them and ask them, so what does soft skills mean? And to them it means a few things. It means leadership skills, it means communication skills, it means group skills, it means ethical thinking skills. And those are all great, and you'll have exposure to all of those in the MBA program. So what we do, I think, is really important. And yet, when you drill down on them, and if I ask them, so what does leadership look like? How would you know it if you saw it in your organization? How would it manifest itself in a middle manager? You tend to get more opaque answers. You tend to get answers like, I know it when I see it, right? And people around them will resonate with them. And they'll be informal leaders. And I drill down, okay, well, what does an informal leader look like? Well, it's kind of the people that you want to go to. Well, how do you know that the people are going to them for the right reasons versus the ones who happen to be complaining all the time? Well, you just know, right? And at some level, there is a level of management gut intuition, but there's also a really important side that I think that we sometimes miss in the translation between what we're willing to talk about in business schools and in the private sector, and the reality of what human beings are, that is sort of still taboo in terms of what's talked about. So I'd like to dive into that today, so that's what I'll be talking about. So some of the hard truths about soft skills, they're incredibly hard to teach, because just think about what we're trying to teach. How do you teach leadership? So we take a cut at it in terms of what are the good skills, what does a follower mean, how do you become a good leader and a good follower, what are the sorts of things that you do, but incredibly hard to teach at its fundamental root. Also, it presupposes that you aren't already on a journey, which of course you are. It's not like you came into this room and had never heard of leadership, or went into your first job and never heard of leadership. Of course, you started learning about these things very formative years in your life, right? Very young. And so sometimes we assume that we're going from zero to nothing, or really trying to move the needle, when I think a more honest view is that how do we take you across the spectrum from where you are now to a very condensed period. As I said, you're making an investment, and where are we going to move you in that intense period in life where you're sitting down and able to reflect? Because for those of you who are doing it full time, that's a real privilege in a way, right? Because you have the ability to reflect for 16, 18 months, 24 months, however long it takes you, hopefully quickly, but you have the ability to reflect in that time. And you don't have that very often in your career. So it's a good opportunity. So not only are they hard to teach, they go beyond the fluff, and let's admit that there is fluff. In the business consulting and the coaching literature and in the leadership literature, which a lot of my stuff is published in, there's a lot of crap out there, right? And there's a lot of people who are experts in leadership, as an example. So you have to cut through some of that. In fact, when I was doing the title for this presentation, it was initially titled something cute like, soft skills, the hard truth or something. And of course, I Googled that and there's a book on it. And so, I looked at the book and I grabbed my hair because it was all about, you got to communicate better in groups. And I was like, really? Is that all that there is? So I thought, okay, let's talk about something a little bit deeper. And they're a lightning rod for industry. And I mean that because I think that industry, it's interesting. Industry always says to me, the technical stuff they need to know, and what they really need to know, we teach them. Which is interesting, because we call that hard skill. So that's always a bit of a sore spot for me. That the hard skills are the financial skills, the analytical skills, we need you to know that. But the soft skills, the stuff that makes for promotions and they're really looking for in terms of managers and who becomes into the C-suite, they all talk about soft skills. So just in the naming, there's something really important to own for all of us in terms of how we think about skills. It's by soft skills we are making a judgment about what in fact those skills are and how valuable they are, right? We got hard skills over here and soft skills over there. But what I really put it up there for, their lightning rod, is the sense that I hear about them all the time. I mean, I can't think of a meeting that I've had, at least in the last little while, where we haven't talked about soft skills at some point. And why aren't we doing more? And why aren't grads coming up with more? And it's not just undergrads, it's MBAs as well. Right? We need them to be really strong in soft skills. And so I always push back to hear exactly what do they mean. So how do business schools typically respond to the challenge? Well, the kinds of things that you'll do, and that I think are important, are networking events, and you'll have lots of those because you have to learn to network. Most executives will tell you that your career is about chance as much as it is about hard work. And so I'm not putting down hard work, you gotta do hard work. There's no substitute, but you also have to be in the right place at the right time. And many executives who are well-grounded will admit that. And networking can do that for you. Etiquette classes are great, right? It's important to know what hand to hold the glass in, absolutely. It's important to know which fork to use. All of that stuff is important. Leadership courses increase attention paid to ethics in almost every business school, experiential and indirect learning, and self-assessment and reflective exercises. We do all of those things, and I think all of them are great as a reaction to what we hear in industry. Because I think business schools is a professional school, a little bit like a law school, but even more so unsure of itself. All business schools. And so we react whenever we hear industry saying, we need something, and we give them this. And I'm not sure that all of those necessarily always touch upon the journey of the human being. And so what I'd like to do today is get into 4 sort of concrete steps. Before I do that, I want to talk about this disconnect just a little bit longer. So the larger issue for me is about personal self-awareness. And sure, that seems airy-fairy, but I'm going to make it a little bit concrete in a second. It's also for me embedded within issues within Western culture. And so for those of you, because the Ted Rogers School really is representative of the next generation of business leaders, we are at the forefront in terms of the diversity in our classrooms. It's such a strength. And so we can talk from multiple cultural perspectives, but realizing that we still have a Western bias in how we teach. And so the Western bias is very much an individualistic culture, as you know. And so it's all about sort of us and who we are and what we're doing. But what it doesn't sometimes recognize is the nuances in what we're doing. That if you go to other cultures, you don't have to talk about nuance. You certainly don't have to lecture on nuance. They understand that there's a side of themselves that they don't show in public. Certainly not when government is around, that many of them might not trust. There's a certain side of themselves that they might show around friends or out at a university. There's a certain side of themselves they might show around people they would trust with their lives. And so it's hard for us to understand that how do you teach soft skills training in a global world where you're going to have to interact with these kinds of people who get that the human being is complex? And they aren't showing all their cards, of course, because they understand that we're complex and that we evolve and we change. And yet we're sort of thinking, well, you are what you are, right? And you're always going to be the same person. You're going to bring those skills with you to work that you have at home. And I'm saying that it's slightly more complex than that. So again, the root of the soft skills development is the journey of the human being. And yet, being an emotions researcher and an OB researcher, the pushback in doing that work, especially when I started doing that work, was enormous in organizations, right? So they would buy in, and that took a little while, to the notion of emotional intelligence, only as far as it helped to predict your ability to perform in the organization. Other than that, why were we talking about emotions? Why are you here? Right? What do emotions have to do with anything? And I can't just blame organizations for that. That goes back to, if you read some of the interesting stuff, if you want to read an interesting book, write down the name Damasio. He writes a little book called Descartes' Error, where he talks about how Descartes, started us all thinking about how cognition and emotion are two very different things. And he's left quite a legacy in terms of how we think about the world. That there's thinking people and there's feeling people, but don't let your feelings interfere with your thinking, right? And of course, the reality of how our lives are is that, we now know, of course, through neuroscience and other ways, that how we think and feel happens in nanoseconds. And of course, how we feel influences how we think as much as how we think affects us how we feel. So some of that legacy is still in organizations, that they don't really want to talk about the emotional lives of their organizations and don't really feel all that capable of doing so. And I'm not saying they have to get into it in detail, but they have to, if they're going to say soft skills are important, then I believe it's sort of missing the boat if you're not willing to talk about the emotional development of your employees. And discovering yourself is something you do with the shrink, right? That's the firm belief. And of course, at a fundamental level, I agree with that. You're not going to work to figure out all your stuff. But you are going to work to still figure out how you fit in. And so to think that you aren't going there as a process, a social process, for the 8 to 10 to 12 to 14 hours, depending on how much you choose or have to work, is crazy, right? That we do go to work and we do use it for other reasons, and for many of us that is the outlet. And so despite organizations really talking about soft skills and wanting them, how they approach them is very limited in terms of what it can do for us. And so how do we address this gulf between, if you think about the triangle, we've got industry, we've got business schools, and we've got the real complex lives that you folks are leading. We've got these three things, and how do we align those stars? I don't have all the answers, but what I'm hoping I can do today in the short time I have is that to address those, I'd like to offer 4 empirically and conceptually, theoretically grounded ways at looking at yourself and the world around you that you won't typically hear in any business school, and you won't typically hear in industry. All are easy to discuss, but like all of life, the key to them is in mastery. And don't mistake what I mean for mastery, because in the West we tend to think of mastery in the same way that we think of self-actualization, as though it's that destination, right? We're going to master something, as opposed to the journey. And of course I'm talking about the journey. All right, so the first one is owning your space. So that's feeling the confidence in who you are and what you do and where you stand, and in your opinion, so that they can be shared and given, that self-doubt is allowed, right? But that you feel confident in who you are. So you know your feelings, you own your feelings, you avoid dissonance. And by dissonance, I mean explaining away what it is. So if you were late on a project, you think about, why did I do that? Why was I late? Instead of coming up with the excuses saying, oh, it was unrealistic deadline. If it was on you, it was on you. So it's about owning it. If you make a mistake, admit it. And can you sit with yourself, right? So you own yourself. You own that space. Okay, so that helps me get into the second one that I hope we'll have a little bit of fun with. Stop apologizing. So in this one, awareness is always the first step. maybe you're aware of how often we apologize in daily life, but it's unbelievable. So I'd like you to take little nuggets that are easy from this talk away. Just be more aware of how often you hear the words, I'm sorry, in your day. Because when we say I'm sorry a million times, of course it loses its impact. But it's also reflective of why are we saying I'm sorry? What's the reason for it? And so examples of that can include, we've all been on elevators and the elevator door is about to close and it's that awkward moment because it's closing automatically and somebody's trying to get in. And you're on a packed elevator and somebody in that elevator, sometimes more than one, will say, I'm sorry, right? Like they're somehow responsible. Now, that's a fun social thing to talk about, I'm sorry, and it just could be a social convention. But it plays out all the time. I was just in a meeting with executives, and I knew that people were coming in at various times because of their busy schedules. So I was talking to the CEO, having a good conversation, and one VP came in about 3 minutes late and said, I'm sorry, and went on and on about where he was and what he was doing and why that was so important, and totally interrupted the flow of the conversation between the CEO and I. And then another VP came in about 6 minutes later and said nothing. Said nothing about where he was and joined the conversation and was extremely productive. And so I left thinking, why? Why did the first one have to tell me he's sorry? Like, what's going on with that person? Because it was outside of the norm, you see? So this story is often reflective of what I'm getting at. Sure, we can have fun with it, but it's that sometimes that story might be saying, wow, I don't feel all that good about myself. And it's weird because when I go to talk to them, there's this, the division between industry and academia is really interesting because us who have grown up in the academic side, of course we have industry experience, but we've never spent tons of time in the C-suite. And so I go there thinking, wow, you guys have got it together. You're running corporations. I'm here to listen. I hope I can take it all in. And they're thinking, my God, I haven't got the kind of schooling you have. I'm not sure I should be in the same room with you. I hope I can say something that's smart, right? All of that stuff. And the collision of that, if we don't own our space, coming back to the first slide, is a whole bunch of, I'm sorry about that, right? That sounds crazy. And yet, we pass in the night. And that doesn't just happen with me going to somewhere else. That happens in organizations all the time, of young people who are getting started in their career, talking to a senior person, feeling as though they don't know how to own their space, saying, I'm sorry, that was a crazy idea, I don't know what I was thinking. If it was a good idea, stand up with it. If somebody tells you it's crazy, let them own it's crazy. If you don't think it's crazy, don't admit it, right? You might think it's crazy, I don't, right? I think that's a really important lesson. So that's the superficial apology, and so it does bother me on that level. But the deeper issue for me is, because we do these superficial apologies, we no longer know how to do the deep apology. Because you can't have a culture that says I'm sorry 15 times a day, and then the sorry really stands out as being important. And so if you hear a typical deep I'm sorry in our culture, it tends to be one that says, I'm sorry, there's a lot going on in my life. My wife and I are having trouble. My son's giving me a hard time. I've got my boss breathing down my neck. And at the end of the day, what is that, right? It's you're qualifying everything you've said. So you're saying I'm sorry, yet the only thing that people are remembering is all of the qualifications. And a great apology in an organization, because sometimes we do make mistakes, doesn't have any qualifiers. So please think about that in two ways. That is, how often we apologize and say I'm sorry, why we're saying it, because this is all about the soft skills that are underneath it. And secondly, on the deep apologies, if you really want to apologize to someone and you want to touch on what we know from the literature in terms of the reconciliation literature and us understanding how we know a real apology affects an individual, it's when an apology comes without qualifiers. That I've heard exactly why you were hurt or whatever, and I am sorry, and this is how I feel about the situation. making it completely about that person. It's a very different paradigm from, I'm sorry, and here's all the reasons why it happened. And that's kind of become our default, certainly from what I hear each day. Okay, the third area, another fun one, is yes and. This comes from a lot of different literatures. It touches upon the personnel psychology literature because it touches on, if you think back to performance appraisals, you've all, I'm sure, had performance appraisals, and what do? Our boss sits us down typically and says, these are the things that you're great at, and I'd like to talk about these things that you need to work on. And what do we all do? We just focus on the latter, right? We hear everything after the but. You're doing really well, you're developing, but, right? But this. It also comes out of the theatrical improvisation world, which I've been fortunate enough to get into on this side because it's fun. There's also an academic side to it. So the notion of yes and is rather than yes but. And it's both a tool that you can use in terms of soft skill development, but it's also a life philosophy. So let me talk about it as a tool first. So when you say yes but to someone, right, and a typical yes but would be, I'd really love for us to try this marketing campaign. I've been thinking about it forever. I've got the research done. And somebody in the organization who's been there for 10 years says, we did that in 2006. And I don't think it's going to work for this. That's a typical yes but. They might not have used the words yes but. That's not really important. The point is that they've kind of heard you a little bit, and then they've killed the idea. And so as a tool, using yes and can be very important. Very powerful. In fact, in my own personal life, since I've joined this for at least a decade, I try to say but as little as I possibly can in life. And it's amazing at how you can converse with people and how that changes the dynamic when you say yes and in conversations, even in heated negotiations. It changes how people react to you. You aren't shutting them down, right? So if you want people to respond, understand that small words can shut them down. And especially as you climb up in an organization and people are looking to you as the ones, is my idea a smart one? If you want to know how to really encourage people, it's probably to understand the power of yes anding in whatever form you want to do it. As a life philosophy, as I said, it can be hugely changing because you can approach life as yes and take the stuff that comes to you as an adventure, right? I'm not saying, go bohemian, we're a business school, but what I am saying is that it is a really fun way to approach life, to say, yes, and where will this take me? So you take the job that I'm currently in, I'm surrounded by a lot of really smart academics, some of them have a lot of really good ideas. And you're really only going to move a place like this in a very positive direction really quickly if you have a lot of people who are championing what they do. And so one of my roles as the biggest cheerleader is to give people enough rope to be able to say, go for it, right? Go and do it. Absolutely. So I can see the connection to mission. Sometimes it's not as clear as I'd like it to be. But the point is I want to give people the ability to keep going for it. And that's a bit of a life philosophy that I apply and I would really urge you to think about in terms of how open are you to different things, not just at work, but in your life as a life philosophy. The last point is worth touching on. Building on something, and I know you know this, but to say it is really important because we do it all the time. Building on something rather than tearing something down is much harder to do. It's easy to tear something down, and we're really good at it. As academics, we're good at it. In industry, we're good at it. We can tear down ideas easily. It's a lot harder to build something up. So ask yourself how you build something up. How when you're served something that looks like a dog's breakfast, even from a direct report, how do you make something positive out of that? So they walk away with a bit of their self-esteem intact, yet still knowing they have a lot of hard work to do. Right? It's a very different way to look at the issue. The final is the story of me. It's something that I got to do a TED Talk on, but realized I really need 3 hours because we think like academics. We think in 3-hour blocks. So I need a 3-hour class to go over truly the story of me, but I'll talk about it briefly. So the story of me is the story that we all have that's playing in our minds. We often have multiple stories. So the story could be, am I really good enough, right? Do I have the skills needed in this new role? Can I handle it? But stories of me can also be things like, I kick butt. I'm great at this. I'm phenomenal. People should know more about how good I am, right? And we know people on all sides of that spectrum, and we have stories all in between. So the question is, do you know your story, and do you know how loud it is? Because at the root of all those stories is that desire to be seen, heard, and validated, right? We each have a unique story. So knowing your story and knowing how you project that story is really key, because walking around with a good understanding of the story of me allows you to say, I'm going to park it for a minute. And when you talk to somebody with a really loud story, for instance, if I go up and talk to somebody, as I often do, and they spend 10 minutes trying to tell me how smart they are, at a certain point, right, if I'm at a cocktail party or lots of ventures where I've got to meet a lot of people, I have to pull the plug and say, I got to move on here, right? Good luck with this story. But I can't spend 10 minutes just hearing why you're so smart and why that your company is so great, right? It's got to be about something more. We've got to give here. And so I think a little bit of that is very important in terms of soft skill development, to say, well, what are the stories? What are the things that we're doubting about ourselves? What are the things that we may be too confident about, that we want to be seen about? And you can see those stories, I'm sure, in people you've worked in, and people that you live beside, right? When you're aware of the story of me, you're aware of it all the time. And so when I walk down the street and somebody stops me to talk to me about something, and then I realize, oh my goodness, we're into a story of me, right? Then at least you can then make a choice to say, do you want to try to shift the conversation, or do you want to say, look, I have finite time and I have to choose how to spend it. So if you can think about your own story of me, I think that would be important, because the last bullet on there is, what's the subtext to your story and what lies beneath it? And of course I can't answer that, but you can. And you can if you think about it. Right? We all have those stories, it's natural, but let's be aware of them so that they aren't always in our way. So in terms of a wrap-up, I'd like to ask you a little bit about, to self-reflect on what are the areas that resonated with you in terms of what I discussed today. Those are important, and you'll often hear that question, right, from professors, from other people. What resonated with you? What's far more powerful from the social psych literature is the second question: what are the topics that made you the most uncomfortable? Because we learn a lot more out of our discomfort. So if I said something today where you think, what's he talking about? He's crazy, right? Or I think he's a little off on that one, or that one doesn't apply to me. I would just urge you to go back and make sure that that isn't dissonant speaking, and that there isn't something that might be deeper at work around why or why not you want to dive into that area. Because often discomfort is a very good sign for us all to take a second look. So how are you going to work on the bedrock of who you are as a person? What a phenomenal opportunity to do so in an MBA program. You're going to have lots of chances to do so. How you do your degree, as every professor will tell you, is up to you. How much you get involved, how much you join case competitions, how much you dive into your own story, how much you use this as a springboard to a whole different kind of living, a whole different career even, a whole different trajectory is up to you, right? And that's kind of magical. It can be sort of scary to think about it, but kind of magical for sure. And then do soft skill, and only then, when we have this kind of a deep discussion or begin a deeper discussion, do I believe that soft skills take on personal relevance or context. So thank you for listening to that. Let me just say a few words, if I can, about your time here. That I think that your time here, as I said, that you're joining us at a time where our trajectory is really strong. And let me take a couple of moments to really sing the praises of Dale and Kim, who work around the clock for your benefit. And I see the success of this program is built upon the dedication of our directors and our staff who are out here today. All of them are so dedicated. Do we have the engine of a Rotman? No, we don't. But we're the unbelievable story of the little guy that can, right? Nobody can keep us down. And so we keep working even harder. We outwork everyone. And it was wonderful to see that reflected in the rankings of us coming in number 4 in the Canadian business rankings for MBA programs. That shook up a lot of people. I had a lot of deans talking to me about what are you doing in your MBA program, right? Now, I think the key in that is how do we stay in that position or improve ourselves? And that really is about how much you're committed to the process, how much you want to do the work, how much you understand what we can do for you and what you can do for us. When you start looking for internships, for example, are your expectations realistic? Are we helping you as much as we can? Are you helping yourself as much as you can? Because this is a true partnership. And so my door is truly always open to you. You know, talk to other MBA students. I get out to as many MBA events as I can because I couldn't be more committed to, of course, all education, but I have a particular passion around graduate education and the MBA. I have a soft spot for it because I know how hard you're working. So you will see me around, and I'd urge you to come and see me if you have anything that you want to discuss at any time, because this is a program that's always looking to improve. So let me conclude by congratulating you again on making what I think is one of the best decisions of your life. Thank you very much.